welcome to my first YouTube video. So I've kind of set up this channel to talk a little bit about psychology and careers in psychology and all things related to that. So it would really help me if you could subscribe and like this video. That would be amazing, thank you. So today I'm actually going to be talking about PWP interviews, or maybe more specifically children and young people PWP. So PWP stands for Psychological Wellbeing Practitioner, and I recently had an interview for it before Christmas, and I actually got the post, and I'll be starting in February. The course starts in February this month, so not too long to go. And I thought it would be quite interesting to do a video on this, as I've seen lots of people kind of asking about it. I was asking about it when I first applied for the post. So if you didn't know, a psychological wellbeing practitioner, basically you work for the first year. It's a university course, so you're working like kind of 4 days a week, and you'll have like 1 day in uni or 2 days in uni and work 3 days a week. And after the first year, you're then qualified as a psychological wellbeing practitioner. So psychological wellbeing practitioners are in adult services and in children's services too. Children's services are quite new as well, and that's the one that I applied for. So I'm going to be working in CAMS. So I was already working in CAMS before as a healthcare assistant, and now I applied for the post as a trainee PWP. So I thought I'd talk kind of a bit about the interview that I had, and maybe like some of the questions I had, and maybe how to prepare for the interview, because I know that it is quite popular. I think it's becoming more and more kind of, I don't know, like before, I guess, thinking in terms of wanting to get onto the doctorate, the clinical psychology doctorate, the main route was kind of you have to get an assistant psychologist post. But I think nowadays, lots of people actually go down the PWP route instead. And of course, you can obviously, like, being a PWP in its own right, you can work for a few years. You can work up to being, I think it's a senior PWP. You can work as like a supervisor for other people and things like that. So yeah, I thought today I would kind of, for my first video, talk about my interview and kind of how to prepare and how I prepared for it and things like that. So I've got my notebook here, which is why I keep looking down. It's a big... So the first question that I got asked, which is really, really typical of loads of interviews, I think, no matter what you're interviewing for in the NHS, assistant psychologist posts and PWP, trainee PWP posts as well, which is thinking about what attracted you to this job and what you would bring to it. So for me, when I'm preparing for interviews, this is the main question that I always prepare for and always make sure that I write a really good answer for, because you can pretty much guarantee that it's going to come up in some way, whether it's worded a bit differently or not. That question is pretty much always going to come up in these kind of interviews. So it's really important that you kind of think about what skills that you have that you can apply to this job role, or what skills that you would be able to apply for this job role. So for example, thinking about my role then as a healthcare assistant, I could kind of talk here about building up rapport with young people, also kind of maybe bringing in, if you've got in my psychology degree or my master's, talking about research and things like that. Working in a multidisciplinary team is always a really important one, I think, to kind of bring up here. Another thing to think about that is really important in PWP interviews, just as any other interview, is kind of gaining an understand of what the role is, what you're likely to be doing. And as well, for PWP roles, I would recommend kind of looking up step 2 interventions. So I can make another completely different video on kind of what a PWP role is. I mean, I'm guessing if you're kind of watching this video, you've kind of already thought about applying for a PWP role, so you kind of already have an understanding of what it is, but I can do a separate video on that another time. But yeah, kind of gaining an understanding of IAPT services, gaining an understanding of what like the kind of people that you'll be working with, and kind of where the idea for PWPs came from, and the idea behind IAPT is quite an important thing to research, especially, you know, if you're deciding whether this career is for you. I think it's really important to look up as well. And like I said, maybe that's something that I'll make a different video on in the future. Another good thing to kind of talk about in those kind of questions is thinking about, you know, maintaining a good work, life and uni balance. It's important to remember that obviously you'll have the working side of things and you'll have the university side of things. So thinking and talking about, you know, how you might maintain this kind of balance. It might also be quite good to talk about, you know, your supervision, if you've had supervision in the past, and what you find useful from supervision, things like that. As well as thinking perhaps about routine outcome measures or ROMs, and how you could evaluate the kind of the work that you're doing, as that's something that's quite prevalent in these kind of job roles. So another really common PWP question or kind of situation is a role play, and I think most people that have a PWP interview will have some aspect of role play in it, whether you're kind of told about it beforehand and it's like a big part of the interview, or whether it's just put in there as kind of an extra question, which is what mine was. So I had a role play about covering for another PWP, so meeting somebody, meeting a young person for the first time who normally has a different PWP, but I was kind of covering for her. That was kind of my situation. As well, preparing for, after you've done this, your strengths and weaknesses, which is a question that I got asked immediately after. So I did the role play and then I got asked to evaluate how I think the role play went, and if I was to do the role play again, what would I change about it, which kind of threw me off a little bit actually in the interview. It's quite difficult to immediately reflect on something that you've just done, so that tripped me up a little bit. So that is something to kind of think about. There's likely to be some aspect of role play, and that they might ask you to criticise this or talk about what you think you didn't do well or what you did think you do well, you know, strengths and weaknesses of that role play. Another question I got is indicator that sessions aren't effective. So that's why I think thinking about ROMs is really, really important. And as well, a common question I think in lots of interviews at the moment are the challenges of remote working or working digitally, because of the situation, the coronavirus situation. I think actually a lot of PWPs sometimes work remotely anyway. You know, kind of it's very much focused on CBT, guided CBT, and guided self-help sessions and things like that. Another classic question are the biggest challenges. So thinking about the biggest challenges that you're likely to have in this course, and risk scenarios is another really common one. That again, you kind of get in every single interview, but it's still really important to kind of think about when you're thinking about this one. As well, I think for, you know, any kind of interview in the NHS, AP interviews and PWP interviews, it's worth thinking about different cases that you've worked with, thinking about your, you know, reflecting on your strengths and weaknesses in terms of your clinical abilities and, you know, your knowledge and things like that. Being able to demonstrate, obviously, a good understanding. So for this one, you know, for children and young people, demonstrating that you've worked with children and young people before. And before I worked as a healthcare assistant, I was working in schools as social, emotional, mental health needs, and behavioural support, kind of those kind of roles across different schools. And yeah, talking a bit, I think I talked a little bit about how that had kind of helped me, especially because the job that I applied to was in a primary intervention team that worked quite a lot in schools, so that was really useful for me to talk about. And yeah, I think it sounds quite obvious, but the number one kind of tip is to research, make sure you have a really thorough knowledge of what you're applying for. Both like, you know, the service, and maybe research around kind of why that service is, why those particular services are important, you know, thinking about if it is a new service, or kind of like an established one that's been going on for a while. And yeah, for PWP roles, particularly, I would definitely recommend looking into, you know, the STEPS model, you know, the tiers of, you know, tier 1, tier 2 kind of stepped care model, because, you know, typically PWPs will fit into a step 2 of this model. So it's really important that you can kind of demonstrate that in your answers, and that'll show a really good understanding of kind of what you're going into. So yeah, so I think that's kind of what I would personally recommend looking into when applying for these kind of job roles. Also, you know, thinking about that there might be something before the interview. So I had a panel interview with the Young People's Ambassadors, and something that they talked about was young people's participation, which is really interesting. You know, that was with all of us that were applying for the post, or half of us, I think, that had our interviews on that day, and the Young People's Ambassadors, and kind of talking about, yeah, the young people's participation. So, I mean, obviously you'll know if you're going to have something similar like that before the interview, but it's just something to be aware of when you're applying for those job roles, because it is quite a common part of these interviews. I think some PWP interviews as well, like I said, the role play aspect is a much bigger kind of aspect. For me, it was a question. I didn't have time to prepare anything for it. But I guess maybe it was weighted a little bit less, whereas I think sometimes they tell you about the role play in advance, and you need to, you know, you've got time to prepare for it, but it might be a much longer role play, or kind of a presentation or something like that you need to demonstrate. So I think that is also something to be aware of, too. So yeah, so that's my kind of tips and a bit of background on me as well, and kind of, yeah, some tips about PWP interviews. So I hope that was helpful for people that are looking to apply for PWPs or have their interviews coming up and don't know how best to prepare for them. I hope that was really helpful. And like I said, I guess this video is maybe meaningless for some that don't understand what a PWP role is, so perhaps I'll do a separate video on that in the future. So yeah, so I hope this video is useful, and thank you for watching. Please subscribe if you can, it would be a really big help to me. So yeah, thank you, bye.